Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome everyone, especially Vidya over here for a session on. We are discussing this book, which is a translation by Vidya. This is The Wise Woman and Other Stories. Um, just to give a little background about the book, it's a translation of short stories written by Manu Bhandari. Manu Bhandari, as we all know, has been a writer of repute. She was a novelist and a short story writer, one of the beginners of the Nayi Kahani movement, the pioneers of the Nayi Kahani movement. And Vidya has been an author. She has been writing books for children, and this is her first book as a translator. Welcome, Vidya, and thank you for doing this for us. And the first question that comes to my mind is: you've been a writer, and now you're a translator. So, as an artist, what is the difference that you see? Is there any difference in your how you go about it? So let's begin with that.
Okay, thank you so much, Saba. Hello, everyone, and thank you for logging in to this session. As Saba mentioned, the book is just out. In fact, I got my copy just last night. It's really beautiful, so do check it out. Difference between a writer and a translator. I mean, it's miles apart in some ways and somewhat similar in some other ways. The big difference, I would say, is that when you're reading someone's writing, you are actually getting a glimpse of their own character, right? You learn about that person, not just the characters of the story, but you also learn about the writer from their writing. Whereas as a translator, my job was very much to present Manu Bhandari to you, not myself. So I had to push myself in the background, make sure that I didn't insert my own character into the book. That I think is something that translators have to be very mindful of. That I am just a curator. I am just a guardian of the writer's work. So I should stay in the background and let her work talk for itself. And sometimes it's difficult because you're so familiar with the language that you're translating into. In this case, I'm way more familiar with English. So the temptation is always there to write it in the way you would have written the story, right? And you have to no, this is not what she intended. My job is to make it smooth so that people can read it without feeling like there is a block in the reading. It shouldn't be read stilted. It shouldn't read clunky. It should feel contemporary because I'm doing it in 2020, 2021, not in 1950s and 60s when she wrote. But at the same time, her spirit has to be there. After reading this book, you should know who Manu Bhandari is. And I think that is a really important responsibility for the translator. And I think that's the biggest difference, I would say.
Yeah, and I think you really kind of summed up, this pattern of translation and the role of a translator of taking a certain text from the source language and bringing it into the target language, however, retaining all the nuances. And then you were right about, it's a very pretty book, and I think that's a characteristic of Rowley Publishing House also. They bring out beautiful books. So it's beautiful and it's amazingly well translated. Vidya, I must add,
Thank you.
It really looks like you're reading an original, and you can feel the voice of Manu Bhandari there, and you know that it's written in English. So it's absolutely fantastic. Coming there on the author, was there a reason why you picked up this particular author?
So let me tell you the history of how this came about. My first encounter, you might say, with the author and her work came actually in school. I studied in the northern India. I studied in Kanpur. I grew up in Kanpur. And if you, maybe you also had this, but one of her stories was in our curriculum. It was Kamre, Kamra or Kamre, which is rooms, room and room, which is one of the stories in the book. And actually, it's a very nuanced story. It tells. Let me give a little summary of the story, which is it's about a girl's journey through life. represented through the rooms she inhabits. And it's very clever because what the writer is trying to bring about is like, what are her roles in life? The room is a symbol for the various roles that women inhabit during the journey of their lives. But honestly, in eighth grade, it went right over my head. I did not understand it at all. We read it as like an academic text, and we had to answer questions. And I was like, "Kya hai? Mujhe samajh mein nahi aa raha. I don't know what the heck this story is about." It didn't have, like for a child, you need a strong beginning, a good middle, and a climax. Nothing of that sort. It is just a sort of a meandering story. So I was like, "What is this story?" And I really didn't understand it. Then, 2 years ago, if you recall, the actor Vidya Sinha passed away, and she's my namesake. So I have a soft, feeling in my heart for her, and so I ended up watching Rajnigandha because I think they were showing it on TV at the time. And I was just stunned by the story. I had watched it as a child. Again, you watch everything that is there on TV and on the theaters. Again, didn't get it when I was younger. But now I saw it and I was like, this is such an amazingly mature story for having been written in the 60s. Because you're talking about what is a story about? It's just a journal written by a woman, her innermost thoughts, and she's being devastatingly honest about it, right? She has a steady boyfriend who she likes and loves, but she's not passionate about. And then she has an ex-boyfriend who creates all the sparks, but that relationship is going nowhere. And she keeps vacillating between this and that and this and that, this one or that one, this one or that. And that's it. That's the whole story. And I was like, first of all, Basu Chatterjee's adaptation of it is just fantastic. But you also think about the story. This is a woman who's not perfect, who's not really struggling. This is she in those days, you had stories about suffering women, the atrocities that happened to them, right? And many of Manojji's stories also deal with very sensitive subjects like that. But this particular story, it's just her thoughts. And in a way, what she's saying is, hey, the thoughts of women are important. How we feel is important. It's not all about what we do, what our roles in life, and what our struggles are in. It's also that I have the freedom to be this completely vacillating woman. Yeah, I don't know if I like this guy, or maybe I'd like this. This is how women think. And I thought that was so mature for that time. And then I said, who wrote this story? And that was my reintroduction to Manojji's work. And then I started looking for an English. My biggest level of comfort is English. So I was looking for English translations. And here my ignorance paid off. And the fact that I'm in California paid off because I could not get hold of a copy of her translations except for her Mahabhoj, which is available in an English translation. And maybe it's called The Great Feast or something. And then Aapka Bandi, I think, may be available in, but I couldn't find her stories. So then I said, Arey, why, how come her stories aren't in English? Let me do a translation of one. So I took on Akeli, which was I ordered her book, which is this, this Sampurn Kahaniya, and a collection of her stories. And I said, let me translate one of her stories just to see how it can be done. And I started translating Akili, and I just, fell in love with the author and rediscovered her. As a 50-something person, I can appreciate her stories so much more. I can see all the nuances in them. I can see her intent. And then, as I mentioned in my earlier question, I learned about her as a person, and I really liked her. So once I finished translating that, I was like, come on, I can't be the only person who wants to read more of her work. And then I reached out to publishing houses. At first, I reached out to Rachna Yadav, who's her daughter. And I said, I really am interested. Here is my translation of one story. Do I have your permission to go ahead? And she read it and she said, yeah, sure, go ahead. And that's how this whole thing came about. And I'm very grateful to Rolly Books that they took a chance on this novice translator. I'd never done a translation before. And that's what happened.
That's a very interesting story behind the book. But you also brought out a couple of things. Number one, we're talking about how her stories are meandering, and actually her stories are so free flowing. They are, they're pouring out from the heart of a woman. And I think, again, I mean, I don't want to sound I don't know, politically correct and correct or whatever. So maybe because we have a woman translator, so you could do a job differently. So her stories, and not only Kamera, and even yes, Rajnikanta, of course, when I was reading it, I could actually visualize Vidya Sinha and Amol Palekar, because again, because the filmmaker had done such a fantastic job. But even the other stories, even Akeli, or for that matter, even the title story, the wise woman. These are all, they're kind of working at the subconscious level. You could feel that the stream of consciousness technique is going on in a certain fashion, and to be able to translate that so well is it's really creditable, I
Oh,
must
thank you, thank you. That's very kind of you. It honestly, it was incredibly difficult. If you had seen my first draft, it's so bad. It's so bad because you know what happens is that when you start translating an author who you have a great deal of respect for, the first time you just do it literally. My first one was like exact word to word translation, right? And you're so concerned that you don't want to mess up, you don't want to not have her words really ring through, her character shine through, that it really constrains you. So I think if any of our listeners or viewers want to embark on this project, I would say that the you be prepared for 7 or 8 minimum translations, 7 or 8 versions minimum, because don't say, oh, I did it, I finished. No, you do it, wait for some time, reread it, and then, oh my god, what was I thinking? It was so bad. And and Hindi, Urdu is way harder. Okay, what you did with Gulzar's poetry and all that is like, I cannot even imagine. But even Hindi can be really hard to translate, and we can discuss that a little bit in discussion today.
I think, I hope you're not scared away the budding translators who are
I did it, and I have to say, my Hindi is not that great. My English is great, and I'm very confident in that language. And I feel that if you had to pick which language you want to be more fluent in when you attempt a translation, it is the language being translated into. You can get a lot of help from other people, people who are more familiar in the language, which I did. I got help from my editors. I got help from Sudha Arora, who's just an amazing human being and a terrific writer and a very, very close friend of Manuji. So I knew she would know what the intent was, right? Sometimes, I'll give you an example. One of the stories in the book is originally called Ek Plate Salab. And I didn't know how to translate that because it doesn't have a direct, those words don't appear in the story, right? So it is just a title of a story, which is about nothing. It is about nothing, but it is a beautiful story. I encourage everybody to read it because it just captures a moment in time, and it shows you what an observant eye Manuji had. So I didn't know how to translate it. And finally, after trying a few things, if you literally translate it, it is a flood in a plate or a plate of flood. ये क्या? इसका तो कोई meaning नहीं है. So then I reached out to Sudhaji and I said, I have no idea what to do this. So how would you translate egg plate salab? So she said, a storm in a teacup. And I was like, that's it. Right? And I wouldn't have been able to think of that myself. And as a translator, you have to be humble enough to say, I may be wrong here. And have people read it, and people whose Hindi is really good, or whichever vernacular language you happen to be translating from, and say, did I get this right? Can you fix this? Can you tell me? And they will help you, right? Because everybody wants, I find the writing community, you hear such horror stories about it, but my experience has been just great. Everybody has been so gracious, so kind, so helpful.
And I completely agree with you. In fact, I teach translation here in Jamia, and one of the tasks which I give to the students is like I have a list of titles of short stories which I give it to the students to translate, and this is another one which I'm adding to my list to give it to them. Because I did notice it, but even when you're talking about the other titles, I had noted down a couple. There were, for example, Akeli. I mean, you translate it as the lonely one, or even Aate Jate Yayavar. You translate it as gypsies. But
Gypsies.
yeah, so I was thinking, like, why not nomadic or gypsies? So when you have this kind of a dilemma where you have the synonyms and I don't know. I was thinking, like, just try to solve. Why not nomadic and gypsies or the lonely one, Akeli? I mean, there were too many things that were coming to the mind. How do you finally decide on a word, especially if it's a title?
So, as you said, if you had translated it, it would be different.
Yeah,
And that is where the translator's bias bleeds into the book. You can't avoid it because honestly, there are so many ways of expressing it. All you can say is, was I true to the author's intent? Um, and this is why I would say that the translator's role is not entirely trivial. It is important because you are, as you said, you are getting a tiny, tiny piece of me in that, right? Because it is I who have made those choices. Um, People suggest stories. It is what I feel is fitting. So, for instance, there's another story called Ankush, right? And I was initially thinking restraints, obstacles. I mean, you can translate it in many ways. And finally, we decided to say chains because my tendency in my own writing is to be very simple. I don't like complicated words. I feel like to communicate, you want to be as simple as possible. That is personal preference. I have a
yeah,
lot of respect for people who know the vocabulary and can really express themselves perfectly, use exactly the right word. For me, I have been an editor of an Indian English magazine here, a South Asian magazine here. I have been on radio. I have hosted a parenting show. I have hosted a quiz show for children. I work with children a lot. I'm a tutor for kids here. So my my tendency is always towards simplicity in communication. So if you notice, everything is very simply written. I have not used very fancy words. I have not used complicated vocabulary. The idea is you should get the gist of the story. You should get Manuji's little character peeking through the story. And it should be a breezy read because sometimes the subject matter is serious, right? Because I don't know if you know this, but in fact, I had translated later, after I translated this book, I translated a piece that she had written about her mother for a forthcoming book. And it was about how badly her mother had been treated in her in law's house when she first came. Because that was the custom in those days. It was almost like that, aisa hi hota hai, right? And I think that she was very sensitive to the suffering of women because of that. And so I really wanted to, so many of her stories are very, again, very sensitive to a woman's innermost thoughts and the conflicts that she goes to. And I didn't think that having a very strong literary technique for these stories would capture that. You want to capture it's more emotion. You want to capture emotion. You're not showing off how good your vocabulary is. You want to capture the sensitivity that she had towards other women. And you, if you make it too literary, then you lose the emotion in the story, I feel. I mean, or rather, I don't have the talent to maintain both a literary value to it as well as an emotional value. I had to pick one, and I picked the emotional one.
yeah. And I know I understand what you're saying. But all her stories are, of course, they are women narratives, and you can feel that as the plot is somewhat set in a patriarchal setup. So you definitely get the feeling. I mean, whichever story you pick up. But then again, this was the question which I had in mind also. How did you choose these stories? I mean, these are a kind of a bouquet that you prepared. So did you have something in mind of picking up these particular stories and keeping? I mean, I was very happy with the title, the Wise Woman and Other Stories. So how did you go about in choosing these stories?
So, I would love to say that there was some very, very strong, conscious decision to pick stories, but I think broadly there were two or three factors. One is what stories did I enjoy reading? And I think again that's where the translator bias comes in. If I had had the opportunity to translate all of them, I would have loved it. But when I reached out to Rachna ji, she told me that somebody was working on translating the entire thing. So I didn't want to do that. So I had to pick and choose a small collection. And this is sort of an introduction to her work. And for everyone who gets this book and has an opportunity to read it, I would say go and search out all her stories. She has quite a collection. Even though I think she herself felt that she could have written way more had she not had to look after home and family and children and everything. But there's still a good collection. So that was my first thing. Which are the stories I like to read? Secondly, I wanted to represent the time frame as well. So there were stories she wrote on her own first. Um, when she just sent out, Main Haar Gayi, I think was probably her first story, and she just sent it out as a lark to a competition, or no, to get published in a magazine. She was in Calcutta, I think, and she sent it to a magazine just for the heck of it, right? And when she writes in her autobiography that when that story was accepted, she said, that happiness that I felt, I cannot it was never replicated again in my life in anything. Even though I got better as a writer and I got more acclaim and I got more, but that joy of that first story being accepted for publishing is like you can't duplicate that. So when she wrote a bunch of stories at that time, and those stories, if you read this, and it would be a fun thing for the readers to get this book, read the stories and figure out which one were the early stories and which one were the later ones, because it's not in order. So those stories are lighter. All of them have this little O twist in the tail. So the ending is always a little, right? And they have a narrative. Something happens and then it ends, right? And then she got into this Nai Kahani. She started associating with these writers of this Nai Kahani movement, her own husband, Mohan Rakesh, so many really great minds. And then they opened her eyes to a different way of writing stories, which is you don't need a very clean narrative. You don't need a beginning, middle, and end, a story. You can just write snapshots, slice of life stories. And so I wanted to include both in the collection. The beautiful later stories like Rajni Gandha and Ekhane Akash Nahi, which are like just crafted masterfully. But then I also wanted to include the early ones, Main Haar Gayi, Abhineta, right? So I think anyone who reads this book, I think they'll really have a fun time because you get all flavors of Manu Bhandari in the book. That's it. And the third reason, which is, I'm being very, very honest here, is that I'm a novice translator. This is my first book of translations. I tended to pick the stories which have more plot in them, not very metaphorical ones, because metaphors are really hard to translate and keep the flavor of the original story. I was like, it's beyond my ability. So I'm going to pick the ones where the plot is so strong that even if I make a mistake or two in getting the exact nuance of the metaphor, it's okay. It's, people are still going to enjoy the story. I'm going to still maintain the spirit of the author, the intent of the author. So there you have
I,
it.
I think your response has opened two things. Number one, since I think this already is a fantastic translation, and you keep on saying this is your first and you're novice, so we have a huge benchmark for your next translation.
Oh, I would love to. Somebody please give me an opportunity. Obviously, I'm better, right? I started and then, it was a long process and I got better as I went along. My earlier translations were worse. My later translations were better. Of course, as I said, there were so many iterations that I sort of brought up all the levels. But I know I would do a way better job if I did the same book again. You know? Yeah, that's just
Yeah,
experience.
but and then second question, you know, and especially when you're revising your work so many times, as you mentioned. Another question which comes here, which your answer opens to the next question is: what are the basic issues that you faced while translating these short stories?
Yeah. Well, Hindi, if you, okay, couple of things that as purely from the point of view of how English is written and how stories are written in English and how stories are written in Hindi. Number one, in Hindi, or this is Manuji's style, but I've seen it in other writers as well. There is a lot of movement of the tenses within the story. She'll write a paragraph in past tense, then she'll switch to present tense, then she'll jump back to past tense, then she'll jump back to present tense, right? I think this is perfectly acceptable in Hindi writing, because when you read it, it doesn't actually sound very odd. It's just the quality of the language. But when you try to do the same thing in English doesn't read well if you keep jumping tenses. In fact, one of the first things you learn in an English writing class is stick to one tense. Don't keep bouncing back and forth, because it's just not done that way. So I had to really think first. Of course, as I told you, in my first iteration, I translated literally. Then you read it and you realize it sounds so weird in English, because you have a past tense, present tense, past tense, present tense, past tense, present tense. It just doesn't sound good. So I had to take the tough decision and decide which tense am I going to keep it in. Am I going to keep it in everything in present tense? Am I going to keep everything in past tense? Right? And keep a consistent thing. The other thing that you'll notice in Hindi is that you can repeat words from sentence to sentence, and that's okay because it reads just fine. You can say daya, 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 daya 4 times in 4 consecutive sentences. But if you put mercy, 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 mercy in all 4 in English, it doesn't sound good. Because in English, you're expected to have slightly different variations on the theme as you write, right? So that was another big struggle, because I know what she's trying to say. I know there is one word that is exactly fitting apt for that particular translation, but I can't use it again. So, so that was another big challenge I found, between just the difference in the language, and oh, I have to mention this, and I wrote it down so I would remember this. Hindi has this lovely alliterative way of saying things, right? You have banna banni, garma garam, hathon hath, lag lapet. How do you translate this without losing the color? And I'm sorry to say that in my work, some color is lost because you can't do it. So if you know Hindi and you have the patience to read it in the original, I would say do it. This book is more for people who know the language, who can feel the language, but have trouble reading it. And of course, for anyone who wants an introduction to Manuji's stories, because it's so colorful. It's a challenge. And also, हिंदी में मात्रा का बहुत बहुत importance है, right? There is a sentence. Let me see if I can find it. I wonder where I put it. There is a sentence. Oh yeah, here it is. This is a classic example of translator mistake. Okay, this sentence goes, आत्मीयता के ये क्षण अनकहे भले ही रह जाएं, पर अनबूझे नहीं रह सकते. So this is a sentence, and it's a complex sentence, right? So the first time I translated this, I read the unbujhe as unbujhe, which is completely different. Right? And because they were talking about, this is from Rajnikanda, and because they were talking about a passion, atmiyata, and you, so Anbujhe felt okay, right? And you're thinking, and I originally translated as, "Par Anbujhe nahi reh sakte tu," the fires have not been extinguished, right? And I only caught it on the seventh or eighth version because I'm like, this doesn't sound right. Let me go back to the original and see what she says. And then I realized, oh my god, she didn't say anbujhe, she wrote anbujhe, right? And it's if you don't read it carefully, वो चिंता का चिता हो जाता है, right? The joke that's the चिंता और चिता में सिर्फ एक मात्रा का फर्क है. That's what that can happen to you, and you have to be extremely careful. And I was also glad that I had an editor who actually read all the stuff in original and compared it so we could catch more mistakes. Because, as you know, being a writer, that you get blind after a few readings, you don't see it anymore.
Yes,
It needs an complete
absolutely.
outside person to, yeah, third party to do it. Yeah.
And then once you read all the mistakes, you read them correctly, you're right. No, but is there any portion which you'd like to read out? A little portion in Hindi and then and your translation into English. So we'd just like the viewers to have a feel of the Hindi as well as the English, if you can do. A small
Okay.
paragraph, can you?
I will, but as I mentioned earlier when we were discussing this, I am actually Tamil. And so, even though I'm very, very comfortable with Hindi and I speak and I think in Hindi often, I do have some trouble with the thas and das. So, apologies in advance. So, I wanted to read one of my favorite stories in the book, from one of my favorite stories in the book. It's called Nai Naukri. And I think it was I'll give you a little summary of the story. It's about a woman named Rama who is married to Kundan. They have a very happy relationship, happy marriage, but his career is taking off and put some demands on the household. And guess who has to fulfill those demands? And they have a young child, and she's been working as a lecturer in a college, and she has some ambitions to complete a PhD or write a thesis. And unfortunately, as her husband's career progresses, she's having to make some choices about what to do with her life and how to manage these multiple responsibilities that are there. And it's a very familiar story, right? All of us have felt it at some point of time. And I definitely did, because I came to the US with my husband and I didn't have a visa. So I was home. We had a kid. I was bringing up the kid. And the pinch that you feel, right? That, oh, did I miss out on something? Because my career couldn't take off the way, and who had to make the sacrifice? Who had to give it, right? So this, and I have a feeling that this is Manuji's, her own belief, her own feeling, a little bit popping into that you can have a good relationship, you can have a wonderful life, looking after the home and the children and everything, but will it give you, do you look back? Do you think? So let me read from that. And also, let me mention that this is one of the stories which is very easy to translate, because you can almost feel her writing in English. It's very easy, because I think she was very, very comfortable with both languages, and you can almost feel like, oh, this story reads great in English. There's no loss in translation. So let me see. It is. Okay. So as I said, the characters are Kundan and Rama. So it begins where they've just moved into a new house, and the house has to be decorated, and they have to buy new furniture, they have to decorate it, and he's very particular because his career is just taking off, so he wants to decorate it in a style that's very unique. Who's going to do that, right? कुंदन चाहता था ये काम रमा को ही करना चाहिए, क्योंकि ये काम उसी का था। फिर उसकी सुरुचि और सुघड़ता के तो हल्ले भी ये मित्रों के बीच में, पर रमा के पास समय ही नहीं रहता। सवेरे उठकर वो बंटी को तैयार करके स्कूल भेजती, फिर खुद तैयार होती। तैयार होते होते ही वो नौकर को आदेश देती जाती, सारे दिन का काम समझाती। नाश्ता करते करते वो अपना लेक्चर तैयार करती, तैयार क्या करती, बस सूंघ भर लेती। फिर 9 बजे कुंदन के साथ ही निकल जाती। 3 के करीब वो लौटती, थोड़ा आराम करती और फिर शाम की तैयारी। बाहर नहीं जाना होता तो घर में किसी को आना ही रहता था। रात 11 11:30 पर वो सोती तो थक कर चूर हो जाती। कुंदन को उस समय हल्की सी खुमारी चढ़ी चढ़ी रहती। कहता, डोंट बी सिली। एंड नोटिस शी एक्चुअली राइट्स इट इन ट्रांसलिटरेशन, डोंट बी सिली। पार्टी में कैसे थक जाती हो? गाड़ी में बैठकर जाती हो, खाना पीना हंसी मजाक, इनमें भी कहीं थका जाता है? गाड़ी में बिठाकर ले जाता हूँ। So, you can really feel like she's exhausted, but her husband doesn't get it, right? So, here's how I translated it. Kundan wanted Rama to take charge of the interior decoration. Her good taste was the talk of their friends. But Rama had no time. First thing in the morning, she would get Bunty ready for school. Then she would get ready, give instructions to the servants, and work on her lecture while having breakfast. Then she and Kundan would leave at 9 o'clock. She would get back at 3, take a short rest, and then the work of the evening would begin. More often than not, they would have to entertain at home or go out. By the time she went to bed at 11:30, she would be exhausted. Kundan would get a little irritated. Don't be silly. How can you be tired? You go to the party by car, have a good time, come back by car. Right? So this is one of her more, modern stories, urban stories, and the language is very simple. It's and she uses a lot of English phrases transliterated into Hindi. So you can sense that she's very comfortable with that ethos, and she's very comfortable with that language. And yet, when she writes more, like Sri Subodhini, or when she writes Akeli, and that language is much more um, colloquial, colorful. And she's okay with that too. She's really, and I have such deep admiration. The more I read of her and the more I translate her work.
And her work is all very steeped in culture, so it's very difficult. I mean, and the reason why you find it difficult to translate because it's so culture specific. So when
Yes.
you're trying to take the source language into another language, but you have to retain the culture of the source language, then that is where the challenge comes. But I noticed that you have retained a lot of words from the source language, and you've given a glossary at the end of the book. That also kind of makes a smoother read because the words are not jarring. I mean, it's a very interesting glossary that you have in the book. I was just going through certain that means I mean words like Medan, Kotwal, Titani. I mean, so these are the words that you have retained in the book.
And
Uh,
actually, I just want to step in for a second to say this. That was not strictly speaking my choice. When I started, I didn't know what the rules were these days because I have read, if you remember, R.K. Narayan, right? When he wrote the guide and Malgudi days and all that, he was actually very, very particular about not retaining English words from Tamil or I forget now. He would translate everything, and he was a master. So you never felt the pinch, right? But I believe that this is my, and I would try to translate it into English. In my very early versions, I would try to translate it into English, and I put the word in brackets because I felt like, oh, I don't really like the English translation here, and then or I would italicize it, and then I would put it in the glossary. So, but when I was working in the editing process with Neelam from Rolly Books, she said, "Oh, the these days you keep the word. That's the convention now. The convention has changed. You don't try to translate everything. You don't put it in italics. You just let it flow naturally, organically, and then most people will get it. If the audience is in India, everybody's going to get it, right? But even for an international audience or people who are not familiar with Hindi, the glossary does the job. It's a convention. I like it though. I like this convention that we keep some of the color in.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so see, that is, if I may add to your response, and what Neelam suggested was completely, I mean, I completely agree with it. The first level of translators, every word was translated. For example, words like, ghee was translated as clarified butter. So if you look at a translation from the 60s or the 50s, that is how it was. And I mean, and not only for Hindi, for the different for various different Indian languages, but even as like over this last 40, 50 years, like for example, when I have worked on Premchand, I've looked at the translations which happened in 1970s and the translation which has happened in 2010. There is a difference of I mean the translator or a story is retranslated. For I mean, I also did a book for Rolly Books. I think in 2016 I had done a translation for them, and these were a few stories which were already translated. So it is again, you bring in today's language kind of a thing, and I remember even I had these discussions with Neelam, and so that's how. But the other interesting thing is there. I mean, once I had such a discussion with another translator, and what she would say, I mean, there's no need for a glossary also, because for example, as long as we are translating for the written word, we can have a glossary. What if we are translating it, say a play which has to be performed? So as I'm still looking for some kind of answers to such questions, when we are translating, say, Shakespeare into Hindi, and it's only meant for the stage. So
It's
that's another.
interesting to say that because my husband is actually in the theater and he writes plays that are definitely aimed at South Asian audiences. And he has to retain a lot of the color. And sometimes there are whole sentences in Hindi, and his audience is not 100% Hindi speaking or Hindi understanding, right? They can be people from South India, or they can be people from here locally, in California, Americans who have no idea. But I think you trust the context to gloss over some of those problems. And yes, sometimes you will not understand a couple of words or two, but that's okay. That's
Yeah,
okay. In the
that's
larger interests of just making sure you keep the color, and
yeah,
doesn't sound, because when Indians talk, for instance, when an urban Indian talks, we do talk in a mix
yeah,
of like Hindi, English, and English, right? So there's like three of them. So even I think our movies, which are more which are set in urban environments, they reflect that too nowadays, right? Everybody talks in this mix. It doesn't sound like somebody is written in English and translated into Hindi. They just use the English line there. So,
yeah.
and that's okay. That's okay. You don't have to understand 100% of something to enjoy it, I
But
think.
always, I mean, we have to always assume that the reader is also intelligent. I mean, the reader can also, get deeper into it and look for an appropriate word. But also, when we are translating, especially from Indian languages, I don't know why we as translators always think of the Western audiences or the Western readership. As you were saying, people in India, we would understand all these words. So it's like, when you're translating Hindi, so the rest of the country would fairly understand these
Oh yeah,
terms. So our readership is Indian. I mean,
yeah.
one more question. I mean, since again coming back to Manu Bhandari's stories, these are all women narratives, and as we were saying, set in a kind of a patriarchal mold. Have you, by any chance, looked at other women authors, or have you seen, are there any changes that other women authors are doing? Is there a conscious effort in the writings of how a role of a woman or a role of a woman in a family is being depicted now?
Um, I haven't read too many in Hindi, though I read a lot in English. Here's what is the genius, I think, on the difference between Manu Bhandari and maybe some other writers who write about women. They've all, even though life has gotten a lot better for women, we're still kind of stuck in the patriarchy, and the struggle goes on, right? And there is a lot of room for women to write really heart-wrenching stories about women who are exploited, women who are suffering, women who are stuck in there. And honestly, Manu Bhandari also wrote about those. And I think the key difference between the way she writes and many other women writers write about women is that even though the endings not are not necessarily of her stories are not necessarily happy, I would say, they don't resolve in a way that is, she's realistic, right? They don't resolve in a way that is favorable to the women, right? But she gives her women a lot of agency. These are not women who are sitting around waiting for bad stuff to happen to them, or just crushed under the patriarchy or crushed under their environment. They are fighting. They are fighting through and through and through. I mean, I'll give an example. One of the saddest stories is Akeli, right? It's about this woman, Akeli woman. She had a husband and a son, but her son died, and her husband couldn't take the grief, and so he abandons her in the guise of religion. So he becomes a pilgrim, and he goes off to Banaras, and and that's where he is, and he only visits her 1 month out of 12, and that's just to keep his like duties and whatever. So this could be, you could write really a really sad story about her, and it is a sad story. However, that Soma Bua, she is not a doormat. Okay, nobody invites her, so she just invites herself. She will go to the she will go and attend mundans and shadis, and she will just insert herself into the process, insert herself into the ritual, and that way she gets a meaning and a purpose in her life that if she had just been passive, would not have you know she would not have got, right. Even in and so you can't all these women, whether it is a wise woman, Sri Subodhini, that is the title story. she's she sees what's happening to her, right. And she fights for it. Okay, maybe she doesn't get everything she wants, even though the beginning of the story tells you that her life had a happy ending. But in the narrative of the story, she doesn't, but she doesn't sit there waiting for stuff to happen to her. She's bold, she asks for what she wants, right. And this is a chain, this is a thread that runs through all of her stories, that her women are not perfect, her women are not saints, her women are not successful, but they all have agency, they all have power. And within the constraints of their life, within the constraints of the patriarchy, they fight for what they want. And I really like this about her, because it gives you this message also, that don't give up. You have to keep going, you have to keep fighting. You have to carve out a life for yourself. If life is really hard and it is pushing you on all sides, you have to carve out your chunk of it. Be greedy, get that thing. I really like that about her. And I don't see that in a lot of Indian stories about women, because I think there's so much sorrow. I think a lot of women sort of dwell on that. And I think she's different in that way, because her women don't. I think I was talking to another writer about a story called A Feast for the Boss. And this, I think, Bhisham Sani's story, right? Called A Feast for the Boss. And there is one character there, Maji, who is really bullied by her son. She's old, and she's like that giving tree, right? Shel Silverstein's tree, which is like you keep on cutting it, but the tree keeps giving you, giving you, giving you, right? And that's a portrayal of a lot of women. I feel that is there in Indian writing. They are suffering and sacrificing and suffering and sacrificing. Manu Bhandari's women are not like that. They try their level best to have some kind of a life, even whatever the circumstances are. And I feel that thread of fighting back, of hope, runs through her stories, and I really like that.
You're absolutely correct. We have a couple of questions also showing up. I'll read out a question. We have a question from Mr. Zahid Akhtar. This is so nice to know about the book. I like to know your next projects too. Can we have something on women in business? Some old stories.
I just need the opportunity. If any publishers are out there listening, please reach out to me, and I would love to do more translations, more books. I am currently just at the beginning of a new project, which may or may not happen. So I don't want to jinx it, but I want to write a biography of women. I think we don't have enough biographies of women who have done a lot, in their quiet spheres, in their little spheres. And that's my favorite. That's what I want to do next. So that would be great. I would love to do translation because guess what? This was my first one. I'm better at it now. So I'd love to do more.
I hope that the publishers are listening to that. So
Yeah.
yeah, and Mr. Zahid Akhtar has another question, which is focused largely on translation. He asks, "Don't you think the actual essence and flavors are lost in a translation?"
Okay, as I said, if you can read Hindi, you should read Manu Bhandari's stories in Hindi. There is no substitute for it. Her style, you will never capture. I mean, I've done my best, but you're not going to capture it perfectly. This is for all those people who love the Indian ethos, who are for whom these stories will sound so familiar, either in their own lives or in the lives of their friends and families, but they're not able to read Hindi. So my thing is to expand the audience. I'm not a it's not a substitute. There is no substitute for reading the original. If you know the language, you should read it in the original. But there are a lot of people who can't. It's difficult. And so for them, I'm saying that okay, even if I'm getting 80%, 90% of the story, that's pretty good, right? If I have friends who have never read Manu Bhandari and now they're going to read it because it's now available in a language that they can access. And so Manuji's work deserves that extra audience, don't you think? So I think that's my rationale. And that's my rationale for all translations. There is so much beautiful work in vernacular languages in India, which I don't have access to. I don't read Punjabi. There's a lot of Punjabi. I don't read Bengali. There are some marvelous books. I've been like really looking for English translations of really great Sharad Chandra and Vibhuti Bhushan Bandyopadhyay. And all these stories in English, I can't find it. I would love for somebody to do the translation and just give it to me, and I have now I can read that. So yeah,
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, that holds true for all translations. I mean, if you can read the source language, we read the original. I mean, it's only for people who can't read a certain language, so he reads the translation. I mean, it's a very cliched example which people have quoted all the time, and in spite of being cliched, it really captures about what Mr. Akhtar was talking about. Lost in translation. It's like a bottle of perfume. When you transfer perfume from one bottle to the other, some essence will go. There will be a little bit of fragrance, but at the end of the day, you have to transfer, and it does
yeah,
get
yeah,
transferred.
yeah. And I hope that this inspires people to try their hand at it, because what is the biggest challenge in translation? The actual grunt work of the translation. That's what deters many people from attempting it. But once you've done it, you can get the help of other writers, other editors to polish it, right?
Yeah.
So you shouldn't let that stop you. If you can read Odia, somebody has a question about, can you do Odia stories? I have actually asked my mother-in-law is Odia, actually. It's Bengali, but she speaks Odia. And I had requested her that, there are so many Odia stories, there are so many Bengali stories that she's fluent in both. Why don't you translate it? And she did. After much coaxing, she translated one story. And she did a phenomenal job. What's stopping people from doing it? It's just time, patience, and some feeling that uh, their work will be validated, right? So this is also a request for all the publishers out there. Encourage translations, publicize translations, put translations out there. People are thirsty for good stories, and they've already been written. They're just in different languages, right? Just translate. Just give people the venue and the opportunity to do their work, and to I would love to read Rajasthani stories and folk tales and Tamil stories. And I can't do that, but I would love to. And if publishers were more open to inviting translators to send their work, then I think there is a wealth of stories in India. And the nice thing is, people, despite the social media and our addictions to our phones, short stories are actually very easy reads. You can just pick one story in this short attention span people have these days. You can still read one story, right? So encourage more short stories. That there's a wealth, there's a treasure in India, and I feel it's buried right now, and it just needs people to dig and present it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We have another very interesting question here. This question is by Prasanna Bhushi. She asks, Manu Bhandari's stories, although about women, are not rants against patriarchy. Women are constantly negotiating the choices available to them. What is the language tool she uses to express that agency? Were you aware of this while translating? Her language is not aggressive but has the clarity of assertion.
Oh, that is so beautifully said. I couldn't actually say it any better. Prasanna, that's a phenomenal question. I have to say that I don't really, I couldn't tell the nuances in the language. And now I'm going to go back and actually read the stories and see if the language speaks to me. I rather thought that by creating flawed characters, at a time where women were not portrayed as flawed characters but rather as suffering heroines, I think that was her big contribution. Because if you look at Deepa, or you look at the Sri Subodhini, or that another character who she's been hurt a lot by men, but she Ate Jate Yayavar, right, the gypsy is the story. These are not perfect women. And she doesn't she just by creating these imperfect characters, she is saying that i I deserve respect even though I am imperfect. And I think that is such a feminist, even post-feminist way of putting of writing. Because you don't have to respect me only if I'm perfect. You don't have to treat me well only if I am sacrificing and submissive. I can be a terrible person, and I still deserve agency. I still deserve respect. I think that was what I got out of it. But Prasanna, I will go back and read those stories and see if I can spot what was there in the language to develop that. As I said, what I noticed about her language is her ease of slipping into. For instance, one good story that you can look at is Ekhane Akash Nahi, there is no sky, and she that has two segments. One is in the city where everybody is talking about city stuff, and they're talking in the city language, and then she goes to the countryside, and then her mother-in-law and her sisters-in-law, they have a completely different idiom, completely different way of talking. And you can see in that story the ease with which she shifts from an urban idiom to a rural idiom. um, but no, I didn't notice that, but I will see. I will look for it. Thank you for the question. It really opened my eyes.
Thank you, Prasanna. I mean, and she's just added something to it. Thank you. Voice is difficult to translate and sometimes not necessary in the translated language. Yeah.
That's a good point, because ultimately my aim was, while reading it, can you read it smoothly, right? And sometimes you have there's a little bit of stuff sacrificed to get that. As I said earlier, that sometimes she will have the same sentence repeated in multiple ways, and I had to make a choice. Okay, I'm going to compress this into one sentence. And in Hindi, it's so much more color and so much more flow. But in English, to keep the flow, I had to make sure that I sacrificed a line or two.
Yeah.
And to purists, this may be really annoying. If you were sitting and reading side by side, here's the line, here's the line, here's the line, here's the line, then it might be quite irritating for you. But I hope that's not the objective. The objective is you enjoy it in Hindi if you can, and you enjoy it in English if that's what's available to you. And I hope that's the job that I've done.
And you've done it very well. I mean, so there is there's a comment by Neelam Narula. We just published a translation of an autobiography from Pushto, and now it's available for a wider audience. Yes.
Fabulous. That's
Yes,
fabulous. I can't wait to get my hands on the book. Yeah.
I've read that book. It's absolutely fantastic. So, and even for this one, The Wise Woman and Other Stories, I mean, if you can see that the Amazon link is coming on and off, please do pick up this book and read this. I mean, and there are a lot of comments on that. It's a great conversation, and they're looking forward to read the book. I hope more and more people
Yeah, it's
Uh,
it's available on the Kindle as well if that's how you want to carry it. But I have to say the physical book is so pretty. The bindis are actually embossed, right?
I
So
know.
you have a very, very tactile book. You almost feel like picking on up and
And it's very good. Yeah.
it's beautifully done. I have to say thank you so much to Rolly Books. They really brought it out
Yeah.
beautifully. Yeah,
Beautiful, beautiful.
yeah.
And yeah, we don't have more questions, but we definitely have a couple of minutes. So we can end if you want to read a couple of lines, and then we can end. If
I
you have
think that
something
would take us.
handy.
Well, okay. Let me read a thing from Rajnigandha. Let me
Oh,
see if I
yes.
can
Yes,
find it.
we should end with that. Yeah.
Yeah. And honestly, as you said, the the movie was so good that when I was reading the story again, I just imagined Vidya Sinha saying those words.
Yeah.
Even though I think the story it was modified a little bit to fit the cinematic things, but I think she did such a good job, and you can really imagine her and Amol Palekar having this conversation, and
Yeah.
okay, so this is a portion of the book where she has come to Calcutta for a job interview, and then she hooks up. No, no, can't say hooks up, but she meets her old boyfriend again, with whom she's had a lot of sparks, and she is really debating whether the feeling that she had for Sanjay, who's the steady boyfriend back home in Kanpur, if that's a genuine feeling or if this is the real feeling. She can't make up her mind. So this is a small section. Again, apologies for my Hindi diction. It's not great. So here she's trying to convince herself that the feeling that she has for Sanjay is not really love. सो आज लग रहा है तुम्हारे प्रति मेरे मन में जो भी भावना है वो प्यार नहीं केवल कृतज्ञता की है. तुमने मुझे उस समय सहारा दिया था जब अपने पिता और निशित इज हर करंट बॉयफ्रेंड इज हर एक्स बॉयफ्रेंड निशित को खोकर मैं चूर चूर हो चुकी थी. सारा संसार मुझे वीरान नजर आने लगा था. उस समय तुमने अपने स्नेहिल स्पर्श से मुझे जिला दिया. मेरा मुरझाया मेरा मरा मन हरा हो उठा. मैं कृत्य हो उठी और समझने लगी कि मैं तुमसे प्यार करती हूं. पर प्यार की बेसुध घड़ियां, वे विभोर क्षण, तन्मयता के वे पल जहां शब्द चुक जाते हैं, हमारे जीवन में कभी नहीं आए. तुम ही बताओ, आए कभी? तुम्हारे असंख्य आलिंगनों और चुंबनों के बीच भी एक क्षण के लिए भी तो मैंने कभी तन मन की सुध बिसरा देने वाली पुलक या मादकता का अनुभव नहीं किया. दिस इज सच लाइक चेस्ट हिंदी, राइट? That I will lose color when I'm translating it, but hopefully you will understand. So here is my translation, and I'm apologies for the loss of the color. Today, it seems to me that the feeling I have for you is not love, but gratitude. You were there for me when I lost my father and broke up with Nitish, and I was crushed. The world was looking bleak to me, and you made life worth living again with your tender affection. I was grateful and believed that to be love. But we never had those moments of bliss, madness, those moments where one gets incoherent with love. You agree, don't you? Despite all your countless embraces and kisses, I never felt that all consuming ecstasy, that madness that is love. So,
It's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful.
but
Thank
what
you.
beautiful language she uses, right?
When she uses it beautifully, you translated it equally well.
Thank
So
you.
thank you so much for a delightful conversation. Thank you, Rolly Books, for bringing out this book, and thank you, Kalinga Literary Festival, for holding this conversation so that we can talk about this author and her works.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much. Thank you, Saba. Thank you so much. I had a really wonderful time discussing the book, and I hope all of you will rush to the store and get a copy. And Kalinga Literary Festival, thank you so much for organizing this.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye.